Week 15 of the fantasy football season. Here's a few tight ends I looked at off the wire this week. The first tight end, Dalton Schultz of the Houston Texans. Schultz surprisingly still out there in 53% of fantasy leagues, and he's been a solid tight end more weeks than not, with the last 3 out of 5 games with double-digit fantasy points for Dalton Schultz. The last few weeks, Week 11 in Tennessee, 6 catches, 51 yards. Week 12 versus Buffalo, a catch, 8 yards. Week 13, Indianapolis, 7 catches, 55 yards, 8 targets. And Week 14, in a tough matchup in that one, he had a touchdown called back on an offensive hold from the Houston Texans, where he had 3 catches, 22 yards. So Week 15, a good matchup coming up versus the Arizona Cardinals. They can't stop anyone. They give up the 10th most fantasy points to tight ends on the season. I think Dalton Schultz, he's been a good target and the number 2 option in this passing game to me behind Nico Collins. So Schultz, we know he's a good tight end, good yard after catch guy, and C.J. Stroud's still a young quarterback, where we know young quarterbacks rely on the tight end position as security blanket. So this week, I think he could go out there, Dalton Schultz, in a favorable matchup and help fantasy owners. Next tight end, Theo Johnson, New York Giants. Johnson, he's had a pretty decent season. And obviously with a guy like Malik Neighbors out for the season, and pretty much it's down to Wan'Dale Robinson, Slayton, him in the offense. He's going out there and he's getting targets and making plays for this New York Giant team. So going on by and coming off, he was dropped in a decent amount of fantasy leagues. But this week, good matchup versus the Commanders, 7th most fantasy points to tight ends on the season. Week 10 at Chicago, 7 catches, 75 yards. Week 11 versus Green Bay, 3 catches, 36 yards. Week 12 at Detroit, 3 catches, 77 yards in that one. In Week 13 at New England, 3 catches, 29 yards. He's the second target in this offense in the passing game behind Wan'Dale Robinson and Theo Johnson. And this week, he does have a good matchup versus the Commanders that can't stop anyone. We saw Josh Oliver find the end zone last week. We saw Hawkinson find the end zone. And they give up the 7th most fantasy points to tight ends on the season. So Johnson, after getting dropped in a decent amount of fantasy leagues, out there in 58% of fantasy leagues. Next tight end, Colston Loveland of the Chicago Bears. Loveland, he had a decent ball game at the Green Bay Packers as Colston Loveland. And I've said this a lot in my videos, they got to get him a little bit more involved. And the last 2 out of 3 weeks, he's had double-digit games. Week 12 versus Pittsburgh, 4 catches, 49 yards, a touchdown. Week 13 at Philly, 3 catches, 28 yards. And Week 14 at Green Bay, 4 catches, 29 yards, and found the end zone. So he was a top 10 pick in the NFL draft. He went over Tyler Warren in this year's draft, was Colston Loveland. And him and Caleb Williams is starting to get down more rapport. And obviously with Roma Dunze week to week with a foot injury, a few targets open up in this offense as well for the Chicago Bears. So like I said, Loveland, he's been getting things going the last few weeks. Ben Johnson, we know, likes to use the tight end position. We saw where he was the coordinator. Obviously, was Ben Johnson with the Lions, where Sam Laporte had a few big seasons. And this week, not a great matchup versus Cleveland, even though we saw last week Cleveland give up a bunch of points to one of the worst offenses in the league in Tennessee. But Loveland, to me, he's an ad, and he's available in 60% of fantasy leagues. Next tight end, Harold Fannin Jr. of the Cleveland Browns. It's been a solid rookie season for Harold Fannin, and obviously Njoku's taken a back seat over the last few weeks. I know Njoku, we had a touchdown in that game versus Tennessee Titans, but Harold Fannin, it's been his tight end room the last 4 or 5 weeks. And also as well, Njoku got hurt with his leg in that ball game after scoring that touchdown, so we don't even know if he's going to play in Week 15. So the last few games for Fannin Jr., Week 12 at Vegas, catches 40 yards. Week 13 versus the Niners, 3 catches, 43 yards, a touchdown, a fumble loss. In Week 14, the monster game, 8 catches, 114 yards, and a touchdown. So him and Shedeur Sanders have great rapport, and that's going back to training camp, where these guys were practicing with the backups with Shedeur Sanders and Harold Fannin Jr. So he's a big targeted tight end. He could run the routes. Obviously, he knows the playbook very well. And this week, it's a pretty good matchup at the Chicago Bears that give up the 11th most fantasy points to tight ends on the season. So Fannin, he's having a great rookie season for the most part of the tight end position. Him and Sanders have a good rapport, like I said, and definitely surprising a little bit that he's still out there in 61% of fantasy leagues. Next tight end, Isaiah Likely of the Baltimore Ravens. So Likely, he's finally been healthy over the last few weeks for this Raven team, and he's going out there and producing 2 games in a row now with double-digit fantasy points. His snaps have gone up, and the matchups have been better as well. And another great matchup here in Week 15 at the Bengals that give up the most fantasy points to tight ends on the season. And going back to Week 13 versus same defense, 5 catches, 95 yards, a fumble loss. Week 14 versus Steelers, 4 catches, 25 yards, a touchdown, 6 targets. So this week, a good matchup. Like I said, for Isaiah Likely, he hasn't been 100% until recently, and his snaps have gone up more. And Mark Andrews, again, really hasn't been an option in this passing game over the last few weeks for this Baltimore Raven team. So like I said, Isaiah Likely, I think he's going to go out there. He's going to get his targets. I know Lamar Jackson, the last 3-4 weeks, he's definitely struggled right now for this Baltimore Raven team. But Likely, he's been a good target of his. Going back to last season early in the year, before he was banged up a little bit, was Likely. And now, once again, him and Likely is starting to get things going. So definitely a tight end to head, available in 94% of fantasy leagues. And the final tight end, Colby Parkinson, the Los Angeles Rams. Obviously, with Puka Nacua, Devontae Adams, these other guys really aren't options in this passing game. But believe it or not, Colby Parkinson, he's been solid the last 3 out of 5 games, double-digit fantasy points, and 4 out of 5, 9 or more fantasy points in PPR leagues. Week 10 at San Francisco, 4 catches, 41 yards, a touchdown. Week 11 versus Seattle, 2 catches, 14 yards, a touchdown. Week 12 versus the Bucks, 4 catches, 41 yards, a touchdown. Week 13 at the Panthers, 4 for 27. And Week 14 at Arizona, 3 catches, 32 yards, a touchdown. So Week 15, obviously this could be a high-scoring game versus the Detroit Lions, where both these teams could go up and down the field and put points on the board. And Colby Parkinson, especially in the red zone, has been a big target this season for Matthew Stafford, where teams obviously are focusing on Puka and Adams, even though it hasn't worked, where those guys are having 2 monster seasons. But still, Colby Parkinson, he's been in the mix in the red zone, finding the end zone is a big target. And this week, in possibly another high-scoring game versus the Lions, definitely a tight end, Ted, and he's available in 97% of fantasy leagues. That's a few tight ends I looked at off the waiver wire for Week 15 of the fantasy football season.